South Africa's labour productivity apparently is at a 40-year low. In the Joburg studio, the Power Lunch studio, is Peter Aling, who is from Profit Analytics and in the Quantitative Research division, director of that division. Peter, these numbers are quite startling, and you're quite vociferous with some of your statements here. It says here, SA's private sector labour productivity is a massive 450% ahead of the public sector. We've had a steady decline since the 1970s. And then in speech marks, South African workers are destroying value. Strong words. Where does this come from?
We basically looked at the difference between the South African Reserve Bank calculation of labour productivity and a real measure of labour productivity. The South African Reserve Bank calculate labour productivity as all output divided by the number of employees in the economy, which is entirely unrealistic. According to them, output per employee has increased in real terms from 64,000 Rand per annum in 1967 to 144,000 Rand in 2012. The problem with that is that they count all output including the results of capital employment, and they attribute it all to labour. Our research excludes the increases in output that are attributable to capital and looks only at that's attributable to labour. And if we look at that period in the 2000s, labour productivity was actually negative. For every 1% increase in labour, there was a subsequent decline in productivity of 0.1%.
So what you're saying is this is a basic flaw in the way that the Reserve Bank defines productivity and the way that you think it should be defined.
Correct. It's unrealistic to attribute all productivity or all output to labour. There's many other aspects that result in output, mainly capital. And if you look only at output divided by the number of employees, obviously output per employee is rising. Specifically because South African companies are diverting their resources towards capital and heavy machinery or technology. Mining, for example, are far more interested in employing heavy machinery than more labour. Manufacturing would rather employ production lines than more labour. And the remaining labour that's left in those industries looks more productive because the industries are increasing their output without increasing their employment.
So if you take the Australian example, for example, in the mining industry, you've got trains that don't have drivers, you've got trucks that are run by remote control. All that's got to be taken into account and ultimately will come to South Africa.
It already is. I recently heard of a floor sweeper who was earning in excess of 7,000 Rand per month. What's not being told is that company has one floor sweeper and he drives a sweeping machine and has replaced employment of about 20 people that used to sweep the factory floors.
It's an interesting one, this comparison you make, as I said in my introduction, between public sector and private sector productivity. Obviously, the floor sweeper that's doing something that can be quantified cannot really be compared with, for example, a community worker. I don't think anywhere, or maybe I'm missing the point here, maybe I'm not statistically proficient enough to do so, but I did see the latest job numbers showing that there's been a big increase in, for example, community workers. How can you quantify community workers' productivity? It seems to be an inexact science to me, Peter.
It is difficult where there's not pure profit-related output, but you can measure the value added by either public or private sector entities. The problem is that economically the public sector is not aligned with profitability, whereas the private sector is. So productivity and profitability go hand in hand. The private sector obviously has the profits incentives and the public sector doesn't.
So what's the conclusion of your conclusions that you come to here? I mean, certainly there are certain measures that South Africa seems to do quite well, but you also say that South Africa ranks very poorly, 144th out of 183 countries in terms of business regulations, 117 out of 178 in terms of taxation, and these are sort of capitalist measures that would boost productivity. Is that right?
Correct. Alignment between productivity and profitability obviously would result in higher increases in labour productivity, but I think the problem is more pervasive. I think it's regulations based. You can't blame companies for diverting resources away from labour, given the labour regulations framework of South Africa at the moment, and I think as long as that framework remains in place, companies will continue to invest in capital over labour. I think labour in South Africa will continue to be slightly marginalised. Where companies can drive increased labour productivity they certainly will. And there are companies, we've actually ranked 151 of the JSE listed companies that we could get data for by labor productivity. Some companies are much more successful at generating productivity from their employees than others.
When you saw the NDP delivered by Minister Manuel the other day, did you see anything there that gives us hope for productivity?
Not really. I think expanding government or developmental state, as it's termed in South Africa, is a problem, simply because productivity in the public sector, as I've said, is not tied to profitability or even value output. There are many reasons why productivity in South Africa is not where it should be. I think a lot of them have already been cited. Corruption, it's not very easy to do business in the country. There's many regulations from a labor relations perspective. But at least the private sector has the link between profitability and productivity that's not true for the public sector. Public sector revenues are actually driven by private sector output or taxation, and the value added by government is not directly linked to that.